And good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this Institute for Gender and Development Studies Lunchtime seminar today. My name is Gabrielle Hosein. I'm Senior Lecturer here at the IGDS St. Augustine Unit. And as the Institute commemorates International Women's Day throughout this month, we are really pleased to bring you this lunchtime seminar. First, I should say that the Lunchtime Seminar series has been ongoing for 30 years, and so we continue to walk in the path that has been created for us in our own history here at the IGDS. And also to say that we're particularly pleased to bring this feature here today for you all. So our lunchtime seminar is titled Diasporic Aesthetics in Coconut, Cane, and Cutlass, Women Loving Women in the Wake of Indian Indenture. It is a path-breaking film that was created by the filmmaker Michelle Mohabeer, and which I first encountered in Roseanne Canhai's discussion of it in the collection Maticore in 1999. However, she was talking about the film that was released in 1994. And so we are pleased to feature the work of a woman filmmaker, a Caribbean descended woman filmmaker, Indo-Caribbean woman who has been doing such pioneering work, and of course, who has also been creating films that center lesbian intimacies, queer Indo-Caribbean experience and existence through diasporic aesthetics. Today we have with us Dr. Michelle Mohabeer, the filmmaker, who is senior lecturer at the and filmmaker at the Department of Cinema and Media Arts in the School of Arts, Media and Performance Design at York University. And we also have with us Dr. Suzanne Persard, Assistant Professor, Department of Critical Race, Gender and Cultural Studies at the American University. And actually, I thought about doing this seminar today when I read an absolutely brilliant article that Suzanne wrote on the film Coconut, Cane, and Cutlass. And I thought it would be wonderful for us to have Michelle and Suzanne here together with us in conversation. We're going to be showing the film first. It is half an hour, and we are really privileged to get this opportunity. I just want to be clear that there's to be no recording of the film, and also in the recording of this lunchtime seminar that will be posted on our platforms following this event, the film itself will not be included. So we have a real treat here, and we thank Dr. Mohabeer for that. Before we move to the film, just to say that this is part of a broad series that we are creating here at the IGDS on post-indenture feminisms and conversations about it. And we've had previous seminars by Hosein, who started the series with the conversation we had, A Decade of Visual Arts After Indenture. And we also did a film screening of the film Gyal by Ryan Persard, Dr. Ryan Persard and Pramika Leo, and had a panel discussion about that as well. And so this is the third in that series. So welcome to our speakers. Welcome to you all for joining. So pleased to see some of my IGDS colleagues here, Dr. Angelique Nixon, Director of CAISO, which is doing excellent work around LGBT organizing on the ground here in Trinidad. And I think we can go straight to the film. Welcome to those of you who joined while we were viewing Dr. Mohabeer's film. And for those of you who came in, I'm Gabrielle Hosein, and I am here at the Institute for Gender and Development Studies. And this is a conversation with the pioneering filmmaker, Dr. Michelle Mohabeer, and the brilliant academic, Suzanne Persard. We are intersecting post-indenture legacies with queer histories for International Women's Day commemorations. Michelle's film Coconut Cane and Cutlass premiered in 1994, and its attention to lesbian intimacy, its engagement with indentureship, and its situating of both in questions of belonging to Guyana is, I think, under-recognized in Caribbean queer histories for its path-breaking politics. And we recognize Dr. Mohabeer's contribution this week in an intergenerational conversation as part of the Institute's contribution to documenting and theorizing post-indenture feminisms. With me today, I have Dr. Michelle Mohabeer, and she's an award-winning filmmaker and film scholar, teaches at the School for Arts, Media, Performance, and Design at York University. Her body of films and digital videos have exhibited at over 300 film festivals, conferences, and galleries, been written about in scholarly books and journals, and purchased by prominent university libraries across North America. And I am in conversation with the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine here, which has made a commitment to reach out to Dr. Mohabeer to acquire the film. Her essay documentary, Queer Coolitudes, was awarded Excellence in Direction by Docs Without Borders, USA, and the Intersect Award from Caribbean Tales Film Festival. Select screenings have been the 45th Frameline Film Festival, San Francisco, Buenos Aires International Documentary Film Festival, Queer Migrant Diasporic Film Festival in Amsterdam, Leeds Queer Film Festival, and many more. Her article, Diasporic Media and Self-Reflexive Caribbean Canadian Film, was published in the Journal of Indentureship and Its Legacies in June 2023. I'd also like to introduce Dr. Suzanne Persard, who's Assistant Professor in the Department of Critical Race, Gender, and Culture Studies at the American University and affiliate faculty of the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center. As an interdisciplinary scholar, writer, and curator, her research, teaching, and curatorial practice engage gender and sexuality within indentured Indian archives, visual cultures, and historiography. She was profiled by the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center for her work as an activist and founding member of Jahaji, the first nonprofit in the United States committed to ending gender-based violence within Indo-Caribbean communities. She previously served as acquisitions advisor to the University of Pennsylvania Indo-Caribbean Collection, the first of its kind in the US. And in 2023, she curated the exhibit Remnants of Another at 12 Gates in Philadelphia, featuring artists descended from indentured laborers, Indian indentured laborers in Guyana, Trinidad, Suriname, as well as working in the US, Canada, and the Netherlands. So with those introductions aside, and welcome to all of you that have joined us, we're going to go straight to Dr. Mohabeer. I'm just going to get us into the conversation and then open it up for you and Suzanne. Can you tell us first, in this beautiful and profound and extremely courageous film, can you tell us what was the impetus to making it, Michelle?
Thank you. First of all, I want to really thank you and extend my appreciation for this invitation to participate. It's usually rare that I get a chance or opportunity to speak about my work in a Caribbean context and with a Caribbean audience and a diasporic audience at the same time. So that is not lost on me. And even in Canada, it doesn't always happen. So I appreciate being asked today. The impetus behind this work is really about representation. It's really about self-representation and really the lack of visibility of what I noted in media, in which the same old adage, this film was made about almost 31 years ago. Hard to believe it. I really even can't believe it myself, but it was shot in 1992, completed at the end of 1993, released in 1994. So the impetus behind this film is really about self-representation representation period of the intersection of Indo-Caribbean women and queer sexuality, because I saw no work that really intertwined both of these areas. And I should say that the queer aspect of this film was something that I was very adamant on representing. And my mother is in this film, as you can see. My mother is also an equally strong woman, and I absolutely wanted her to be in this film. Although she did mention that this film might go farther if I didn't include sexuality. The impetus behind making this film is really about not wanting people to understand the history of indenture, wanting people to understand what really this even meant, particularly here in Canada. Because for me in Canada, as someone diasporic living in Canada, we immigrated to Canada when I was about 12, 13 in the 70s. And there is no understanding, even today, still in Canada, what Indo-Caribbean means. We've always been subsumed under this umbrella of South Asian. And I was very adamant that I'm not necessarily South Asian. I always inserted this idea of Indo-Caribbean or mixed race Indo-Caribbean and the Indo-Caribbean presence, because it was 3 generations in Guyana shaped through this colonial legacy of slavery via and then indentureship. So I really have always thought that I could not dismiss that. And the Caribbean and who I am as a Caribbean person, and particularly being born in Guyana, has really shaped a lot of who I am and what it meant to migrate at such a pivotal age as a preteen coming to Canada, and all that I experienced in Canada as well is really what I wanted to put into this film. And this film is not easy to make by any means. This film is very difficult to make, actually, because of the funding issues.
Perhaps you could tell us about some of the challenges, and then I'll hand over to Suzanne, who I know has a lot to say and engage.
Yeah. Well, the challenges was really about getting funders on board for this film. This film, typically, this was as you can see, it's a very experimental hybrid docu-narrative. It is not a conventional documentary. It is not talking heads. It does not use talking heads. All of that was a deliberate resistance on my part. I wanted to create a form that really spoke to the complexities of what I was trying to represent. I can speak to that more. But in terms of the funding, precisely because of that, it was not necessarily easy to get funding. And the major source of funding for this film was from the Canada Council for the Arts. And I got rejected twice, 2 or 3 times, I think. And then there was a great officer at the Canada Council for the Arts who was Chilean. And I've always been indebted to him because he was pivotal in having the jury understand this film, because this film is very much about performance and performativity and how the body moves through and can be moved through time and history. And it's not about pigeonholing the body in history in any fixed way. It's the body traveling across history. It's the indentured body, the diasporic body, all of that. It's the queer body. It's the intersectional queer body. So he was very pivotal in having the jury understand what this work was really attempting to do, and the performative aspect of this documentary as well, and the fact that this documentary was extremely hybrid, experimental, and very deliberately so. It wasn't attempting to be like anything else. So with funding from the Canada Council for the Arts, for which I'm still grateful to this day, because this film would not have been made. And a little bit of funding from, I think it might have been also the National Film Board of Canada, New Initiatives in Film, also contributed some money. That was a feminist branch of the former National Film Board of Canada, Studio D. They also kicked in some money. I believe I also might have gotten a little bit of money from the Ontario Arts Council. It's been a long time. But the major funder was the Canada Council for the Arts. So yeah, I mean, so it took about 3 years to make the film, the short film. That's usual for a film, but usually for a feature film, but not for a film of this length.
Thanks so much, Michelle. Suzanne, please jump in.
Yeah, no, I just want to also echo, thank you so much, Gab, for, this invitation, and all the folks at IDGS for all the tech support and everything leading up to this. And Michelle, it's so wonderful to be in conversation with you. As I said earlier, I saw this film in my 20s, back in 2011. And I remember it was such a groundbreaking film because queer representation, I mean, even in the early 2000s, right, to have this sort of queer Indo-Caribbean representation, and this was playing in Tribeca at the time with the South Asian Gay and Lesbian Association of New York. I remember being out of town and driving back early just to see this film, 30 minutes screening in Tribeca. But I think what you've done with this film, which is so spectacular, is sort of not only include this queer Indo-Caribbean subject historically, right? But the way in which you introduce this mode of fragmentation throughout the film is so fascinating to me. And I'm thinking here of, Gayatri Gopinath's, aesthetic practices of diaspora through fragmentation. And I know so much of this film for you is intentional around the temporal sequencing, right? When we think about indentureship, it's often this teleological progress. We go back to the archive, right? And then we're sort of going into the present day. And the way in which you play with this temporality is so interesting. So I would love to just hear you speak a bit more about, your choices for the sequences of the film, right? Because we see the cane cutter who looks androgynous, right? At one point, which is so interesting. So the first thing is when I look at the iconography of indenture in this film, I see the androgynous cane cutter in this performance, right? I'm not looking and I'm sort of not experiencing this archive of indenture through the violence, the heterosexual violence, right? Which is the historical archive that we know. So I would just love to hear you, speak a little bit about how you thought through these different temporal sequences, right? It's at the end that we see the women in bed together with the barracks and the barbed wire, right? And you don't start necessarily in Guyana. In some ways, I think you start in Toronto, right? So, or is it no? Well, you start opening you start the opening with the river, right?
The film actually begins in Guyana. The very first image you see is Guyana. It's so
River.
it was shot on location in Guyana in 1992, and then it was shot in studio in Toronto using a process called it's film. It's film. It is celluloid film. It is not digital video. I apologize for the sound here because what you saw is a DVD from a film played through my computer, and the sound may have been low. I can tell you that the color saturation is very saturated in color as well. Again, deliberately so. The color saturation, it might not be exact. In fact, it was deep purples and greens, those, and orange and red. Those were the primary colors I used. This film is deliberately disjunctive. It's deliberately fragmented. And the disjunctive nature of it and the fragmentation of it obviously is meant to represent memory, the fragmentation of memory, how memory is hazy, memory is not linear. Nothing about the imagination is linear. It's about all of that. It's about a reimagining of colonial legacies and histories and interpreting it through a queer aesthetics, through a queer lens as well. So it is deliberately disjunctive and fragmented. And I use various titles in the film to organize sections of it. So this is the organizing structure of the film. Without those titles, it might not make sense to some viewers. I don't know. Although the film was highly embraced by viewers, all kinds of people really saw themselves in this film, which is what deeply touched me. I was very deeply moved by a screening I attend at New Festival in New York, in which people who were Caribbean, South Asian, Latin American said how much this film resonated with them. And also because I was trying to deal with hybridity, including racial, cultural hybridity. Again, this structure, this fragmented structure, this kind of hybridity was also very central to this film. I want to say that it's it's a diasporic text as well. It's a diasporic text, which is why I mentioned that it really deals with diasporic aesthetics. I think this film and my representation in this film also helped various theorists who came after with their thinking through possibly about diaspora, because I've noticed the influence of this film, both in film, it's influenced filmmakers and it's influenced scholars. Although few scholars have chosen to necessarily write about this film until recently. I think, Suzanne, your article was one of the first articles to write about this film in the fullest breadth of it. So I definitely appreciate that. And then later my work started to be written about other works of mine. So going back to the idea of fragmentation and time, it was again, a very deliberate choice to make time a chronological, make time deliberately broken, make time deliberately fractured. That was all very intentional. I mean, ironically, in the credits, I didn't give myself credit as a writer. It's poetic as well. I wrote everything you heard, the text, I wrote it. So I wrote, I was on a journey, you could say, when I made this film, a journey back to Guyana in 1992, a place that I had not returned to since I was a child. When I was there in 1992, there was an awful election and a very awful kind of result and a dynamic that really disturbed me, and really profoundly disturbed me and made me so sad. So when I came back to Toronto, it just poured out of me. The writing, all of this, my impressions, it just poured out of me, to how I would then add the voiceover to really construct this narrative, that has a first person subjectivity to it, but it's not simply about me. It is by no means simply about me. I always want to make that clear. This film is only partly biographical, but it is not inherently autobiographical. It is performing an ethnography, a queer ethnography, but it also insinuates many others, not simply Mahade Das or my mother, or Judy Persard later in the film. It's very performative because Judy Persard later in the film and I, it's performative. We perform as lovers. We're not lovers, but it's performative. And then, of course, the two women, the pairing. There's just pairing in the film as well. I use this doubling and pairing. So the pairing with the two actors, Sharon Lewis and Sonia Dillon, who were in the indentured ship, the Fatal Razak, traveling through, and the lovers in the end, with the cane field superimposed. It's a very closing shot of the film, because again, that's an attachment to the colonial body, the censoring of the queer body in the Caribbean, in the colonial space of the Caribbean. This film is complex. I was trying to do so much in this film. So it even is difficult to speak about it without explaining so much. I can't just speak about it in one simple way because there's a lot going on. Let's see. The ending of the film, I'll speak to that, and I can speak to the sections of the film. The ending of the film is particularly important because that freeze frame at the end, that superimposed freeze frame of the vertical shot of the two women's bodies superimposed over the cane field, is really about the disavowal by the nation of the queer body. And the film begins with a jetty in Guyana. It's the seawall in Guyana, and it's a jetty. And I walk out on this jetty and returning back from this jetty. And that's where the film begins, with this voiceover, the love letter to the nation, because the disavowal by the nation for the queer body, and the queer body that would not be embraced by the nation. Of course, it's almost 31 years later, some things have changed. Colonial buggery laws have been relaxed or a little bit overthrown in Guyana, specifically a little bit in Trinidad. There are prides and small prides in Guyana and Trinidad and Tobago. But you know, we still have these legacies of why queer resistance is necessary in the Caribbean, as well as Canada and the US, but you know, particularly in the Caribbean.
I want to go back to that opening sequence. And I think this is what I imagine when I said it's not, I mean, we're beginning in Guyana visually because we're looking at, like this opening. I always say it also is sort of this erotic landscape, right? And so much of this film plays with like the river and the openings and the canescape to evoke Tinsley. But when I first saw this film and you hear the woman's voice, I have felt your absence for the last 20 years, but yet I long for some connection with you, right? And for me, I remember hearing that and, not being able to tell the difference between is the landscape what, the woman is longing for? Is it another queer lover, right? And I thought this sort of ambiguity, even in that moment of, is it the landscape? Is it a lover, right? Was something I wasn't sure if that was intentional or not, but I see these moments of the landscape becoming the lover, becoming home, and the two things being inseparable at different moments, right? So I would, just love to hear you talk a bit about that, especially because the ways in which I think you structure this canescape, is so sort of unique. And again, in the way in which you are not going back to this heteronormative archive of violence. It's these two queer women, right? Reconfiguring the canescape, right? Or like, Kanisha Persard has written about this in Objects in, an essay about Cutlass, right? And the idea of the reconfiguration of the representational meaning of the cutlass. And I see you doing that in this essay. So I would love to hear you talk about that as well.
Yeah, the opening, the jetty scene, I've conceived it as a very alien type of imaginary landscape. It was all in my mind. The way in which I use color to saturate the color in that, and make it, and because the water was really far out, you saw these rocks, you saw this jetty, and it looked very alien when I shot it. That's how I perceived it. So for me, it was about attempting to represent Guyana and the Caribbean space. I mean, yes, it's Guyana, but I mean, I generalize when I say Caribbean as well, but specifically Guyana as a space of loss, a space of remembering, a space of mourning, a space of disavowal. So yes, it has an intentional double meaning of longing for the space, longing for what the space represents. So it's not and the love letter to the nation. So it's literally the lover's body attached to the nation. It wasn't a distinct person. It was a place and a space, and the memories and the context for those memories, particularly from childhood and the formations of identity in childhood. And me specifically, a queer identity that my mother may not have known this, but it started in childhood, in that space. And then it moved to a North American space. So it's interesting how our identities, when they start, how they start from very young ages and what that means. And I was very interested in exploring that in a diasporic queer context in Canada specifically. Sorry, I forget what else you asked about. Can you remind me?
No, just in terms of the way that there are really intentional sequences where the canescape, I think, is very prominent. One, I think of the barracks and the barbed wire, right?
Mhm.
Where
Yeah.
intimacy inside of this violence, and again, reconfiguring violence outside of, the chopping, right? Actually, in this case, it's the androgynous figure that's doing the chopping and the performance.
Yeah. Okay, I'll speak to that. So in the section with the section that's called Ancestral Spirits, I commissioned the performer, Sonali Fernando, who is a dancer, and we worked together to really create this representation with green screen in the back of the cane, and then on the sides, flagged by a gorgeous mural made by Keoma Clear that was more representational of an ancient type of Indian culture. And then on the right, the Guyanese flag, but inverted. And the Guyanese flag was deliberately inverted again to bring in a queer aesthetics, a queer sensibility, again, disavowal of the nation. Everything in this film was so deliberately, intentionally made. Every prop, nothing is accident. Every prop, every mask, everything, color, everything is intentional. Absolutely everything. Nothing was left to chance. This is not a film of accidents. I have made other films where little accidents or happenstance happen in the creative process. Not so in this film. This film was completely designed, made, and very intentionally. So the ancestral spirits in this segment with Sonali Fernando as the dancer, I wanted to have this representation of the ancestral spirit performing on the cane cutting, the plantation, but I wanted it as dance. I wanted it as performance. I didn't want to use archival imagery. There is a couple of very brief archival images, very brief, and used very intentionally in that specific way. But I wanted this interpretive dance to speak to what I called ancestral spirits, the women who cut the cane in the cane fields, and the cutlass. We designed it so that this cutlass would gleam. It was wrapped and clad in this silvery, so it would gleam. So it's very prominent, and this woman strongly holding this cutlass and really dancing with it. It wasn't real. It was something we created. It wasn't a real cutlass. So all of this, again, was very intentionally created to show the strength, the endurance, the stamina. But again, this fracturing as well, because in moments, her body literally leaps in and out of the space of the frame, the midriff particularly, and using the midriff. So, hey, we did the bare midriff before the midriff became, so popularized in the 90s, and written about in a feminist context. So although that is a very Indian cultural garb as well, so we really mix that. And so I've, again, grateful to her for her brilliance in performing this and, interpreting what I wanted. And I collaborated with a lot of people, obviously, in this film. No film is made simply by the filmmaker, me as a writer, director, producer. It's very collaborative as a medium, and this film is obviously highly collaborative as well. So yeah, I mean, that was basically how that came about.
Michelle, can I just get back to this scene with the dancer? I suppose because my own thinking right now as we're speaking is about, and you go back to the Mahadai Das line about the dancing girl and work I've been doing around this dancing girl. And I thought what you did was so powerful in giving the woman dancing so much space for the body to tell its own complicated story in the film. And I also thought that it was interesting that not only did you kind of allow the dancing girl, who I think is an overlooked character in and woman in our attention to indenture histories. And not only did you allow her to say so much, but and when I think back, for example, to there's this one photograph that comes out of the archives in Jamaica, and I haven't seen another one
Yeah,
like,
with the androgynous cane cutter, right?
yeah, and it is, I mean, after I saw that image, it completely transformed my life, and it transformed the artwork that I also began to create. And it's this one image, she's in a dhoti on, or a lungi on a coconut plantation in Jamaica. And I love in a way that you almost instinctively or metaphysically were able to tap into that, the representations of women, possibly including dancing girls themselves, are not necessarily the stereotypes that we imagine them to be today. And also, I think I just want to take a moment to name someone who's a friend of many of us, which is Colin Robinson, who was a longtime activist, queer activist, and founder of CAISO here in Trinidad, and his own politics of claiming the nation as a space of many bodies. And for you to be doing this work um, at least a decade before he had begun to write about it publicly in the press and articulate it in his Trinidad queer politics, I think again adds to the path-breaking nature of this film. It's claiming of the nation and the right to exist, but on terms that are not heteronormative and on terms in which the Indo-Caribbean is also not marginalized, but part of a trajectory of a shared history as well. And so that scene really brings it together for me.
Thank you. I will say this. I think that I was meant to make this film. I highly believe in a kind of a spiritual channeling. My practice as an artist is very, very intuitive. It's very imaginative, very intuitive, and I I see ideas. I see images before the writing. The writing comes after. The images come first. So I felt I channeled a lot in this film. I felt that I channeled ancestral memory. I felt that it came to me. It came through me. It came to me, and I at time was a vessel. And I was meant to make this film, and I think this film would be my legacy. I've made many films, and I've made the bookend to this film with Queer Coolitudes, which tackles the problematic term coolie, and queer coolitudes, those slurs. But I think that Coconut Cane and Cutlass will be my signature film for its aesthetics, for its complexity, for the nuanced representation of displacement, fracturing, diasporic aesthetics, etc. So anyhow, I just think I was meant to make this film, and I'm grateful I got to make this film. And my mother was also very instrumental in helping me with this film as well. I mean, I'm grateful to her for participating in this film. I also want to point out, because it involved different people and communities as well, a younger version of myself was performed by Trinidadian poet Ramabai Espinez. Her daughter Mandisa was the young girl in the film, so want to acknowledge that as well. So actually, there was a lot of Trinidad and Tobago presence in this film. Ramabai's daughter, Judy Persard. So it's not simply attached to Guyana. So it's very much a conversation, I would say, even between the two countries, because I used to travel back and forth to Trinidad and Tobago when I was a kid. From Guyana. So Trinidad and Tobago has a place in my imaginary as well in the construction of this film. Yeah.
Nice. So Suzanne, I'm going to hand over to you for maybe
Yeah,
our
I just
last
have one last question.
discussion. Then we have a really rich audience here, and but small enough for us to have a wider conversation. So I'm going to be opening it up.
Yeah, so one very last question. And I think, because I'm here speaking on this film and because I wrote it, an open access essay, a lot of people have read it and I really appreciate the engagement. But I also really have to give gratitude and recognition to Roseanne Kanai for writing that first piece back in 1999. This was like writing about queer work and covering this film when no one else was. So I just wanted to also say that. So the very last thing.
Sorry, Suzanne. Actually, what's interesting is that she was doing that writing in 1995 at the
And then it was published in 1990.
at the Indian Diaspora Conference, which was held here, organized by Brinsley Samu and others. And that conference was a very path-breaking one in which a lot of work, including Shalini Puri's work and so on, kind of first became presented, although published in 1999.
Yeah, I think that's what,
Well, yeah, I just want to point out that in Matacor, Roseanne invited me to actually contribute a chapter to the book about my film. And I wrote about my film. I think the article was about self-reflexive aesthetics, something to that effect, and diasporic queer. So that became part of Matacor, that book that Roseanne Kanai did. So I was also happy to be part of that, because I do write as well, and I have written about this film, but it's always kind of strange to be a maker writing about your own work, because how that gets perceived as well. But I mean, I am also a scholar, a film scholar. So writing about film is second nature to me as well. So because I'm a scholar of film and I'm so studied in film and the creation of film, this film is obviously created with someone that has all of this kind of knowledge and cultural memory and all of that. And so it's all embedded in this film and in the practice and making of this film.
Yeah, so going off of what I was, intending to ask was the idea of having this very explicit, sequencing between queer women in the, at this point, you're filming this in the early 90s, right? Um, Tell me, I want to know like more why did you feel that it was important to do, to have these very explicit scenes between women? And I mean, explicit in quotes, right? It's a really powerful move. It's a powerful decision. I think it was sort of actually on the flyer that they advertised it when I saw it back in 2011. It was the two women with the sienna sort of overtone and the curtains on, in the bedroom. And that's how the flyer was, that's how the movie was advertised. So I want to hear more about, this was a really bold decision to make at the time. And, you could have done queerness in very different ways, right? So why particularly this specific, film sequence? Why, what was so important to you about that?
I think there are two really bold sequences in this film. The mass sequences, people forget about the mass sequence. The mass sequences in this film, the various undoing of things in the mass sequence, the undoing of how people are perceived, of how a subject is perceived, of how I was perceived, and also that ending of the film, the love scene. The film is poetic. The film is sensual. The film celebrates the erotic, the body. And I titled that section "The Exotic and the Erotic" because that is basically how women of color, all women of color, have been perceived. We've been perceived in pornographic ways as exotic erotics. And I really wanted to break through and break down that exotic erotic aspect of the sexualities and the sensualities of women of color. So I really wanted to create this kind of deeply sensual, poetic, imaginary sense of women lovers, particularly Indo-Caribbean women lovers, in this forbidden space, in this forbidden imaginative space of the Caribbean. And I wanted to celebrate that. For me, it was so crucial to celebrate that. I will say that for me in this film, I was very influenced aesthetically by two sets of films. Black British cinema from the UK, Isaac Julian, and Martina, oh, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on her last name right now, a film called Passion of Remembrance. That stayed in my memory when I made this film. And also props to Marlon Riggs's Tongues Untied, which is a brilliant Black queer, a film about Black queer men, and particularly influenced me for the mass sequence in this film. So I think those two, it wasn't Canadian films that inspired me, it was those two very pivotal queer works by Black filmmakers. My work also has an aesthetic which moves between Black and brown, and I deliberately as well complexly intertwine that in all of my films pretty much. So it has a hybridity in many ways. So the ending, anyhow, going back to your direct question, that is why I wanted to celebrate Indo-Caribbean sexuality, queerness, the complexity of the body, the fact that why is it the queer body could not have been on those ships, women and or men, again, breaking with the heteronormative narrative and scripts of indentureship, of slavery, etc. Those bodies then traveling on ships, and the kalapani, the blue water, which in the film is actually purple, or black water, is actually in the film represented as a deep purple hue, which you can a little bit see here. So all of that again, the texturing, the saturation, the poetic. The film has a romanticism about it as well. I will say that, and so it even probes the idea, the romanticism of the exile. It probes that as well. this kind of longing, all of that, it has all of that interwoven in it. So as I said before, I mean, I think I was meant to make this film, and I just poured everything, every aspect of who I was into this film. So this film is also about me as a person, me as an artist, but also me as a person and what preoccupied me. It's weird to see it so many years later and think about where one is at one's point in one's life, and when I made the film, where I was then. What has changed and what has not?
Thank you for that. So we are going to open up. We have people that I'm sure want to chat with you and Suzanne. The floor is open, any and everybody. Hi, Anita. Welcome.
Thank you, Gabby. I hope you can hear me. This is such a beautiful event. Thank you so much for organizing this. I so much appreciate seeing the film again. I also saw it when I was in grad school and got it from interlibrary loan from far, far away. And it's just such a pleasure to meet you. I want to ask you about Mahaday Das. I've done some research on her. Her work is so beautiful and influential to so many of us. Can you tell us a little bit more about her? In my research, there's not that much available about her. Can you tell me, about your relationship with her, about her involvement in the film? Anything you can say, I
Um,
really appreciate it.
Michelle, hold
yeah,
on.
well,
I think it's possible for us to take a few questions, maybe two or three, and then another round after, just to get a few people in.
okay, I hope I don't forget. I mean, I'll briefly answer about Mahaday Das because that's a very brief response, actually. I met Mahaday Das when she was not at a good time, in a good space, emotionally and financially. And what you saw of her represented in the film is really all I could have done with her, and I wanted to do more, but it was not possible because she just wasn't emotionally and psychologically and physically available. And I traveled to a place called Highflock, which is outside of Guyana, which is more of a Dutch area in Guyana, where she was living. And we literally had to track her down. I did everything I could to make sure that I would include her in this film. It was very important to me to do that. And so what you saw in this film is all I could get of her attention. She was not in a good space. She, as you saw, she had a stroke. Her PhD studies got interrupted. She came back to Guyana. She was very impoverished. So I paid homage to her through her poetry, through that brilliant poem, They Came in Ships. And I interpreted that in the film. So that was the way in which I could elongate her presence in the film, was through the reference and the homage to her through that poem, They Came in Ships. So I'm afraid that's all I can say about Mahaday. She died shortly after. So, a couple of years later. So yeah, I mean, it's all quite sad. But I'm grateful that I was able to have her be in the film for, this length of time.
Anita, I'm just going to open it up to some others before we maybe circle back for more. Um, Anybody else wants to jump in on the conversation, even not just questions, but any comments or reflections on the film as well? Floor is open. Laurie, share. People just jump in.
Hi, thank you so much. Great to see this film. I'm so glad to hear you got some funding. As somebody who studied film in Toronto as an undergrad, I understand how difficult it is to get funding afterwards. So glad that you had this support. I wanted to ask specifically about the way that you use the projection. So sometimes you had scenes where there were images being projected onto bodies, as you sort of mentioned before, but also sometimes you were projecting images like landscapes and so on in the background. And then you had, I really appreciated not the talking heads, but the images, faces, people's faces, and so on. Still for us to really take them in and observe and sort of reflect as we're hearing the voices. So I wanted to just ask you to talk a little bit about those decisions.
Well, the French screen projection, which today would be called green screen, and is used so commonly but was not as common then. I mean, for me, it was a way to add another complex layer, in a sense of rupturing of space and place. I was very, because I interwove the space of Guyana with the space of Toronto, and the projection, the front screen projection, was a way to do that, was a way to bridge space and place, distance, temporality, etc. It was a way to do all, to explore all of that in this film. So the front screen projection really became a signature style for me in this film and a couple of others. And it's something that I deliberately crafted to also represent the idea of displacement of the diasporic identity, the displacement, the fragmentation, and the rupturing of diasporic identity. So the front screen projection is really about removal of a directness to space and place. And it's really a way to interpret that, in terms of the aesthetics.
Thanks for that
Thank
question.
you for that question.
Yes. Suzanne, if at any point you want to jump in, please do. Yeah.
I want a chance for folks to be able to talk to Michelle.
Yeah. Share Singh, you
Yeah.
want to jump?
Hi, my name is Shahrazad. I'm Guyanese also, and I have to say I'm quite prejudiced and proud of Michelle because she's my niece, and when she was making this and any of her other films, I was very supportive and intrigued by her work. And this film is provocative and intuitive and took me back to the kind of stuff I grew up on, and also taught me a few things. So I think it was before her time, sort of, when she made this sort of this leap into making this film. And I'm proud to see that what it has become today and how it's going. I myself, I'm the chair of a national organization for women on justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it's impressive to see films like this, where today it's a little more acceptable to show to audiences and so on who might have bias and all that. But all in all, very proud of her work. And I think I'm happy to see today, even today, all this time since, that everyone's having a conversation on it and highlighting, us in the Indo-Caribbean, looking at the kind of experiences we have had growing up and all the issues that came with it. And even today, working through the kind of experiences of multiculturalism and intersection and everything that goes with it. Thank you.
Thank you, Shahrazad. Suzanne, when we were talking in preparation for this, you were also talking about coming into lesbian organizing, lesbian community organizing of various kinds, queer organizing in an earlier phase in the US, and how much you've been able to see things change as well, and much more openness and acceptance of things that may not have been as easy to talk about when you had first begun a longer time ago. How do you see time shifting in that sense?
I mean, when we started Jahaji Sisters, 2007, 2008, around this time, we were obviously mobilizing around gender-based violence. But a part of our work was also, it wasn't just about gender-based violence. The work was deeply intertwined with reproductive justice, advocating for, LGBT communities. And so I would run workshops, within groups of Indo-Caribbean women, and I would be giving speeches about being queer, coming out and doing this sort of intersectional work in the community in front of, my mother, aunts, or our grandmothers. It was a really intergenerational space. So in this sense, when you think of a lot of queer organizing today, you usually think of like young people and the pride flag. And, Jahaji was always a queer feminist space. It was always an intergenerational space. We had people's mothers, aunts, grandmothers, right? And so I think, something about that work and advocating for gender-based violence in that context, was transformational because we weren't sort of just organizing in the sense of, again, very like Main Street, equality or pride, right? We were sort of a group of Indo-Caribbean women, straight and queer alike, who came together under this, goal of wanting to address violence in our communities. Now it's really interesting to see Jahaji have many, many more queer and trans folks who are out. But yeah, around 20 years ago, I was the only one visibly out in the community. And, I think when I come back to this film too, I think what's so interesting and amazing about this film is that it has given us this queer Indo-Caribbean, but specifically like, lesbian archive, right? And it's sort of the film itself has become this archive, right? So when we go back historically, we don't need to go back to the British lugs, right? And the ship registers, right? We can look at this as sort of its own archival work. And I think that's sort of been a big part of the transformational potential there as well.
Beautifully said.
If I can comment, I think I around this film and now filmmakers now making work, I think a huge difference I see is you all mentioned the courageousness in making this film at the time when I made it. And yes, it was, but I think it's interesting that today a lot more work is being made by BIPOC, queer BIPOC people who are getting a lot of funding, or maybe perhaps not now that EDI initiatives are being clawed back, but at least up to now, within the last few years anyhow, about 10 years to now. So this, and in a sense, it's more okay to make work that deals with identity, that deals with diaspora, etc. But I'm finding that the work that's made now, I've seen a lot of the work, very little of it is actually that experimental. Some of it is, but it's still embracing a very conventional, more traditional approach. Just a small facet of it is using a more kind of hybrid or experimentation. So I think that I'm thank you for saying that this work is archival, because while it makes me sound really old, I guess I am. I don't think of myself as old, but hey, so it goes. But I think it's important that film also be embraced. Film from, particularly this film and other films, be embraced in that way, because we learn a lot through media as well, and media teaches us as equally as much as the archives, books, etc. So that kind of visual medium and the poetics and all that visual media allows is also important.
Absolutely. Before I close, we are at the moment of closing, but is there anybody else who wants to come in and say anything at all from our audience?
Gab, may I say?
Of course.
Sorry. Sorry,
Gab.
just a quick note to say thank you so much, Michelle, especially for this film, which, to echo some of the thoughts of others, was something that I saw when I was in grad school, and again had to work really hard to get access to it. So it's a pleasure to be able to revisit it. And just to say, some of what I love about how you ended this was on this image of pleasure and the celebration of women's bodies engaged in pleasure, and how important that is for our movement forward. And especially as you're describing, the ways in which our bodies are labeled or cast within a certain kind of gaze. I think there's a very powerful way in which you redirect that gaze and allow for the fullness, again, within the space of performance and visual, for so much more to be said and to be imagined about possible futures for us and for our communities. So thank you.
Thank you.
I don't think it can be said better than that. And thank you, Lisa. Lisa and I are soon going to be putting out a call for submissions to a collection on post-indenture feminisms. And this work and these series and these conversations are all part of that kind of community building process of shared engagement, reflection, and archiving, as Suzanne said so beautifully. These are our archives. They're not the colonial archives. They're our own. As we close, I would very much like to thank you, Michelle, for agreeing to do this when we spoke so many months ago. This was a real treat for us to have this opportunity to hear from you, and also to, particularly for me, in the context of International Women's Day, to recognize you in the way that and your work in the way that I think is important to Caribbean feminism to do. Suzanne, your article, as I said, and you said it's open access, on Michelle's film is what inspired me to then create this conversation. And Suzanne is producing brilliant work, everybody. I find it tremendously thoughtful and inspiring, and so thank you for that as well. Those papers are out. And just to end on Lisa's note, just to say that when we produced the collection on Indo-Caribbean feminisms through the Caribbean Review of Gender Studies, which is the IGDS's in-house journal founded by Professor Patricia Mohammed, one of the first pieces that Lisa produced in that issue was on Jahaji, at the time Jahaji sisters, but was on documenting the work that was already beginning to happen and its intersectionality.
Yeah,
And
she interviewed us for that. Yeah, Simone and I. It was good to see you too, Lisa.
I
Great to
think
see you.
as we think about feminisms, we think about activisms in particular ways, we think about poetics in various ways, we think about archival work in various ways. And I think today my hope was to combine all of them in this coming together. So I want to thank you both. I want to thank our audience, and I would like to thank Lesedi Legal and Catherine Chan of the Institute, who are always doing phenomenal work behind the scenes. And for everyone who may want to share this, the conversation will be available on our platform so that you can use it. In fact, this series is about producing content for students and a younger generation to have access to, where you can actually hear people speaking about their work who you may not have been able to access or may not have known about. So we are producing content for future generations, for a younger generation to be able to draw on. And so this will be available on IGDS's platforms for viewing, not the film, but certainly the conversation. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.